we're ready to wire the proposed new name form in the UI to the API that we just created. This API expects a contest ID, which we're going to read from the underscore ID property in the current contest, and the new name value, which we're going to read from the input in here. So right now, this form does not do anything because it's not wired. It actually did something. It submitted because that's the default behavior of a form. So let's take a look at our contest component because this is where we have the form. And let me put these on multiple lines to make them more readable. So we have an input and we have a button here. And this button is a submit button. So to start working with the form, we need a handler. So we can actually handle an on-click event on here, but since this is a submit button already, let's handle an on-submit event on the form itself. So on submit, we're going to do an event handler. Let's call this event handler handle submit. Names are hard, huh? That's probably the laziest name you can use. And handle submit is going to be a function here. So handle submit is a property that receives the event. And the first thing we want to do is we want to cancel the default behavior. So prevent default on the event. And let's make sure this is working. I always try to test as small of a change as possible. So when we submit something here, it's working, it's console logging test, and it did not do the default behavior of submitting the form. Great. So the next step for us is to read the value that the user typed. And we can do this in multiple ways. I'm going to go with the easiest way, which is to read it from the DOM directly. So we're going to put a reference on this input element. Let's call this input the new name input. And to read the value, we can use React's this.refs property, which is an object that holds all the ref attributes that we defined in the component. So the attribute that we just defined is called new name input. And this would give me the actual DOM element for that input. So I'm interested in the value that I just typed in there. So let's make sure this is working as well. Submit. And I'm reading the value that I just typed in the input. So now remember that this component is mostly presentational. It really is a presentational component that has a little bit of event handling. So it doesn't own any state. So we should probably place a function on the parent component to add the name and then pass it for this component to invoke. So the parent component is the app component. And in this app component, we are going to define a new function, call this function add name. And inside this function, we're going to call the API. So add name is going to need the new name to add, and it will also need the contest ID because these are the requirements for the API. So we'll come back to this add name in a little bit. So let's pass it down to the contest component. So add name is a function, add name. And in the contest component, we're now receiving a new property, which is a function. So add name is a new function. And now I can use this add name basically here. So instead of console logging this, we're going to do this.probs.add name and pass it the new name value that we just typed. And we also need to pass it the underscore ID property for this component. So this.probs.underscore ID. Now this is another property that we need to define. So underscore ID is string dot is required. I really think is required should be the default here, but unfortunately it's not. So we'll have to specify is required in everything that we require. Cool. So now we need to define an API for this add name. So we definitely want to export that as well. So add name, and we know that this receives a new name string and it receives a contest ID string as well. And in here, we want to return an Axios call, but this time it's a post call, not a get. And we're posting to simply /API/names. However, we're also posting data in here. And Axios by default will take this second object that we specify and send it to the request as a JSON object. So in here, what we really need is the new name string and the contest ID exactly as we define them in the API. Axios is going to give me a promise. So let's do a .then on it, response. And in here, I want to just respond with the data because we prepared the data to have both the updated contest and the newly created name object. This is looking good. Let's go ahead and use it from the app component. So in the app component, we are importing star as API, which means we can just call this API method, api.addName, pass it the new name and the contest ID. And in here, it will give me a promise. So this has the response from the API. And what I want to do in this promise is basically change the state somehow. So we're going to do this .set state here. And I definitely should also handle the error in this promise. So let's simply do an error for now. And let's think about what do we need to change on the state. So remember what the response is going to give us. It's going to give us an updated contest, and it's going to give us a new name object. So let's first update our list of contests to include this newly updated contest, which will take care of updating the name IDs. So we're going to go with the list of contests that we have on the state is going to change. So we're going to start with the current list of contests, this .state.contests, and then we're going to include this newly updated contest. So we can use a dynamic ID here and read it from the response. So response.updated contest._ID. Remember, we're now doing everything as _ID. And this would be the response.updated contest. So that's the first thing we update on the state. That will take care of changing the name IDs array. However, if we only have the values here, we're not going to be able to read them because we do look up the name using this .state.names. So we actually need to also change our names object to include the newly created name. So this names object would be this .state.names, and then include the newly created name, which is read the dynamic array response. And I see that this is also should be response. Response.newName._ID, and this is the response.newName object. So I think this is everything we need here. So now we have an API call, and we're invoking this API call under this add name function. We're passing the add name for the contest component to invoke it. The contest component is invoking this add name property with the input that the user types and the _ID of the contest in this component. So I think we're ready to test. Refresh, submit, and the new name appears in the list. However, we have not reset this field after we submit. We should definitely do that. Let's actually check if the name was persisted as well. So reload, and looks like the name was persisted. So let's handle resetting the value. So after adding the name, we can simply do this same call here and reset it to nothing. Let's test. Submit. The name is here. The form was reset, and the name was persisted.